Good morning. Welcome to Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, June 3rd, 2020. I guess I should say good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. I'm still in Mountain Time, but eventually I will get out to Washington, I promise. We are really grateful for this panel session, and we are really looking forward to it in just a moment. But I want to give everyone just a little bit of a taste of what we're doing this month in our Broadband Breakfast Live Online discussions, because it is slightly different from what we've done over the past 2.5 months. We started this series because of the coronavirus pandemic and because of there are ways in which broadband is a solution, can be a solution to the issues, the disconnectedness caused by the pandemic, and that continues, and we're continuing to follow that in our coverage on Broadband Breakfast. But we are also moving on to other topics, and the topic that we're going to be speaking about for all month of June is digital infrastructure investment. This is the conference that we are co-hosting with Broadband Communities in August 10th. I'm going to just share just a quick image of our media kit and our conference, which is taking place again on August 10th in Houston, Texas. However, the great thing about this event is that it will be a physical and virtual event. So what do we mean by that? It will be accessible to you whether you are in person at Broadband Communities or not. That is to say, online. And so as a physical virtual event, we're committed to making sure this event has engagement from people virtually as well as live in Houston. And so the event on August 10th from 1 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time will cover 4 broad topics. And each of the next 4 Broadband Breakfast Live Online, we're going to tackle one of those topics. Today, the topic is topic 1, last mile digital infrastructure. The brief blurb states, ownership models are evolving. Who will play lead role in constructing? What entities, including cities, will own digital assets? Who will manage the networks? So that's some of what we want to talk about here today in our discussion at Broadband Breakfast Live Online. So I have a great panel here with us. They include Roger Timmerman, CEO of Utopia Fiber, also Monica Webb with Ting Internet, Isaac Finer. I'm never quite sure how to say it, Isaac, but thank you for being with us. Isaac and Roger were both with us on the preview webcast that we had yesterday with Broadband Communities, and thank you to many of you who watched that and are now with us. And then batting cleanup will be Daryl Gentry. Daryl's the CEO of Next Level Networks. Kind of a new player on the scene. We look forward to hearing a little bit about his interesting model. I'm going to just go back for one more minute before I open it up to everyone and say a few words about open access. So Broadband Breakfast is a media company that focuses on broadband policy, internet technology. Better broadband, better lives is our logo or motto. We're also a unique and inclusive media community. And that means we don't take sides on some of the religious controversies around fiber or wireless or net neutrality, Section 230. That said, we do pride ourselves on seeing a little bit ahead of the curve, seeing things that are going to be important a few years from now. And open access is definitely one of those issues. We've been following it for years, and it's beginning finally to have a greater currency, greater attention, greater focus on it. And I'm so excited for today's panel because we'll really be able to have a discussion about multiple flavors of open access, what it means, how it works, what's the on-the-ground realities when you are running an open access network. Okay, so finally, and just give me another 30 seconds here before we go to our panelists. What is an open access network? Well, unlike a network in which one company owns the assets, operates the network, and offers services, an open access network breaks that apart. It could have one player owning and operating, or one player owning, another player operating, and then still others offering services on the network. And today we're going to talk about that. And to start, I'm going to turn to the largest open access network in the United States, Roger Timmerman, CEO of Utopia. Tell us a little bit about Utopia, your background, history, and we will eventually get into the different models you've used in Woodland Hills, Morgan, Idaho Falls. But be general and tell us a little bit about Utopia's story, Roger. Here, I'm going to unmute you now.
Okay. I've been involved.
There you go.
Oh,
you're unmuted.
Is that better?
Yeah.
So I've been involved with the fiber networks, various fiber networks for quite a bit of time. I initially was involved with the Provo City fiber network, which is now part of the Google Fiber networks. But at the same time in Utah, a lot of cities were looking at doing fiber networks. They didn't want to be in this business. You know, there were cities, they were good at certain services, not necessarily technology savvy. You know, this was really outside of their wheelhouse. And it takes a lot of resources to do fiber networks. And so they decided rather than do it independently like Provo did, there's another network, Spanish Fork City in Utah that kicked off around the same time. They decided let's pool resources and create an independent entity that could focus on that fiber to the home effort. And that was only after efforts to go into the private sector and trying to entice them to upgrade and provide better services. And the context of that is really interesting because this was back in 2002 when Utopia started. And so you think, what were they talking about? What, you know, there was no Netflix, there was no Facebook, YouTube, none of those things even existed. You know, this was dial-up is insufficient. You know, there ISDN lines, things like that were just barely becoming available. And it was like, hey, fiber solves this problem. It's future-proof. And so anyways, these cities banded together, created Utopia. They didn't want to compete with private sector. I mean, that's an important tenet of this whole open access idea is we're not out there to harm investment from private companies. We actually want to help them. We want them to be successful. And so what we do is we remove the most difficult obstacle or barrier of entry to providing service in an area, and that is the capital cost of putting in the fiber infrastructure. And we allow them to use that fiber infrastructure to provide services. And as we define open access, we hear all sorts of different, you know, definitions. And, you know, from our perspective, it's got to be open in the sense that many providers need to be on that system competing with each other. You know, we're really trying to facilitate a successful private competitive marketplace rather than just either a municipally owned and operated and serviced system that's just replacing a private sector option with a public sector option, or even what we might call a public-private partnership where, you know, a city might put in fiber infrastructure but only allow one operator or service provider on that system. Those are not what we consider open access. They truly need to be open and allow many options. So Utopia put this in place and didn't have a lot of options at the beginning. There was actually AT&T was the first one on Utopia, but it was kind of a division of AT&T that doesn't.
That was the old AT&T, right?
Yeah. So it's not part of today's AT&T, and that part of AT&T went away, and it discontinued the services that they offered on Utopia. We got a couple other providers on board. We started building into different cities. The 11 cities that started it and participated in the first projects in 2004 weren't contiguous. And so there was a huge effort in building a backbone across the state to interconnect all of these cities. Some of it was purchasing existing routes, some of it was leasing, some of it was new build. But it took quite a bit of effort to put that in place. But it was also very expensive. And so the economics of the overall project suffered a little bit, but it did grow and built out areas in these different 11 cities. The turning point was really around 2009, 2010, when we really kind of hit our stride. We built some new networks that were independently successful from a financial perspective. And a big part of that turnaround was the market changed. I mean, we started having streaming services, and people, you know, it came to a pretty quick conclusion that, you know, these DSL lines and you know, we were past dial-up by that time, fortunately, but even then people were frustrated with the services that were available, and demand really increased. And so we saw kind of a windfall then. And then we've repeatedly bonded and expanded. And it's gone so well with these new incremental projects with those original cities that other cities said, hey, I used to not want anything to do with you guys. You guys were an example of what not to do. But now suddenly you're showing us that you can build sustainable municipal fiber networks that are open access that pay for themselves. And so we started doing that over and over.
Well, Roger, let me get you to focus just a little bit, because I think this is particularly useful for this discussion we'll have today with this group. And if you're watching on broadbandbreakfast.com, on the very page you're watching, you'll see panelist resources. And there's an article there that I wrote on Utopia, a model open access network. And I went through your builds, Roger, in Woodland Hills, in Morgan, and what you're doing in Idaho Falls. Just take a minute to sketch the difference between each of those, because that would be particularly relevant for our discussion here today.
Okay, so everything previous to that were collective projects that were bonded collectively. You know, basically we would bond them, but we needed backstops from cities. It was usually in the form of sales tax revenue pledges. So we got a good rating on those. Cost of money was much higher back then than it is now. So that's another thing that's gone to our favor. And that was working fairly well. And then there were some legislative restrictions that came in to try to kill us, and we had to kind of change from that strategy because there were some limits put on the use of sales tax revenues. So we've had bonds and financings that we've leveraged, franchise revenues as a backstop for UIA projects, and so we've had all these different mechanisms. And then we did a project in Brigham City. So this is a little predating Woodland Hills, and that one was different. So in Brigham City, what that was basically we went and said, hey, we don't have another mechanism available right now, but we could finance this if you were to have almost like a special service district, but done on an address by address basis. And so in Utah, it's known as a special assessment area. And so we used people would voluntarily sign up on an address by address basis, and then an assessment was put on their property for 20 years to pay for the infrastructure. And we, many people know of that model as the Ammon model, but we did it way before they did in Brigham City and at a larger scale. But that's very similar to what they've done with their, I think they call it local improvement districts, but it works basically the same thing. So we did that model, and there were some real pros and cons to that model. It worked. We got the take rates we needed. It's been financially successful, but there's some problems with exacerbating the digital divide. I mean, long-term property owners are more likely to participate in that, and the renters aren't, and lower income are not. And so, we did see a divide that actually was caused by that model. And so then we went out there and we did, we eliminated contracts. We raised the cost of the service, but had shorter terms on it. And we saw higher take rates and demand. So then Woodland Hills comes around and they said, well, we've been looking at options for fiber, and they were actually looking at subsidizing an incumbent to upgrade. And we said, hey, for the cost that they're demanding that you pay them to just subsidize them with no guarantees of pricing or tiers or anything like that, you could just have your own fiber network. So instead of writing them a check, they wrote us a check, and we went and built the network, and they did their own financing. So they own their own network. It's not our asset, and they paid us for it. And so when they sign up, they just have a contract with the city for the cost of the infrastructure. And then they have the normal pricing from our service providers that we extended to that network. So that was a different model, and it's still unique compared to other cities. And we said, that's fine, whatever suits you, that works. But we built it, run it, operate it, just kind of turnkey from their situation. Woodland Hills, a very small city, it's about 350 homes. So it was an expensive build relatively because the homes are spread apart in very large homes. But we have like 70% take rate there. It's really a popular service there. So then the next city came along, and that was Morgan. And Morgan said, well, we don't really have money set aside for this purpose. And we see that what you've done with these other projects you would finance them, but then you would also service the debt with the revenues, and you charge the customers for that part of the fee, the bill, which is $30 a month. We charge directly to the customer for the infrastructure, and then the providers charge for their services. We did that model in Morgan, so we bonded for that project. They had to provide a guarantee at a take rate, basically a pledge against the financing cost of the project. But we have It's like 25 years plus a couple years of capitalized interest. So we have a period to build it, market it, sign up customers, and the revenues are there well before the debt service hits. And so I don't remember what the timing is. I think it's sometime maybe about a year away before the debt payments actually start on that project. And we've already cleared by quite a bit where we need to be from a revenue perspective. So that project, although it's very new, it's already been built, already grown, has the revenues, and it's paying for itself. But we did the financing in their behalf. Idaho Falls, now we have another situation. Idaho Falls said, well, hold on, we have some fiber in the city. We have fiber people even that know how to build and operate some of this, but we don't have a lot of people. So we're not equipped to do a citywide network. We don't know the technology side of things. They were just leasing some dark fiber in the city. We said, hey, we could come and help you guys take that to the next level and build fiber to the home throughout and do this whole open access, competitive service provider marketplace for you. We've already built all these tools and have all these operations and people, and we get a phone number in Idaho Falls, but have them ring into our call centers and tech support and all that other stuff. So it was really nice. We kind of took everything we do and created an a la carte menu for cities and said, what do you want to do? And if you want to do those things, then you get this portion of the revenue that we normally charge. And then we'll do the other things. You just tell us what you don't want to do.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Roger.
Partnership. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
No. Thank you for going through that, and that's kind of a little longer than we normally want on an intro, but it's useful because of that difference, and because what you just highlighted is your flexibility to work with different cities on what they want and need. So now let's turn to Monica Webb of Ting Internet. Thanks for joining back there. We lost you for a moment. We're glad you're here. Tell us, Monica, a little bit about Ting Internet so that our audience understands, and it looks like it's just getting situated here. But shall I go ahead and unmute you? Okay. Yeah, we're just having a little difficulty on the muting. Try one more time. All right. Let's go to Isaac, and then we'll come back to you. Isaac, tell us a little bit about whose systems, the role you play in open access network, both in Sweden and in the United States.
Sure. So hi, everyone. My name is Isaac Feiner. I work for a Swedish software company called CS Systems. I'm based in Blacksburg, Virginia. And our background is really from open access. In really short, the Swedish communities back in the 90s, when internet was becoming big, were being ripped off by the incumbents when they were buying their connections to anchor institutions like schools and hospitals and everything. So they started looking at how it would be to build fiber networks on their own, and they sort of found out, well, many of us have our electric utilities and know how to build, put those cables in the ground, so probably we can try fiber. So many communities in Sweden started building fiber, and when they had built fiber to connect anchor institutes, they realized maybe we should connect our residents and our businesses, because Sweden, I think the thinking was, Sweden is kind of remote. It's a small country. To be competitive at a large, on a global scale, we need the best technology and the best communications technology overall. So they invested in building this to better their communities, making it more attractive to businesses and help businesses and grow and residents thrive there. They quickly realized, though, selling services is not easy, especially telecommunication services that were new. So that was when the open access model came about in Sweden. And I wrote a piece once that can probably be found on our website about different open access models, and you hear it all the time. So we often talk about true open access networks, which means, and that is the kind that is around in Sweden, which means you can not only choose from multiple providers who deliver services on the same fiber to your house, you can actually pick and choose from multiple providers at the same time, and that requires quite sophisticated software separation to separate these different providers from each other, so that they cannot see which one is selling to what customer and on which terms, etc., because that would harm competition. So it's extremely free, unlimited choice for the consumer, and our role in this.
Let me just jump in, Isaac, with a question. So I laid out this difference between the three-tiered model, ownership, operating services, versus two-tiered, where one entity owns and operates, then still has multiple service providers. Could you just describe which of those is more common in Sweden, and what role does whose systems, you kind of started to get at this, play in facilitating that? So go back ahead.
Yes. So what we facilitate is a software platform, an operation system that is used by the entity operating this network. The service providers who are selling services, they also work in this system when they publish their service offerings and change prices and terms and everything on the marketplace, where all the different options are listed, and where customers can go in, buy the service, and have it activated instantly by our software. So in the beginning, these cities often, okay, we don't want to be the service provider because that's really tricky dealing with end customer and providing these IP services. So instead, they were owning and operating these networks. Then over time, many of these smaller networks, they realized, it's tricky even operating these ones. And now we see these nationwide operators coming who are actually operations companies for hire, much like Roger and Utopia is doing for some of these cities where they run operations. So in Sweden now, we have a number of big nationwide operators that operate multiple networks for cities. So it's been sort of a consolidation. And the biggest one with over 50%, way over 100 different networks, they are using our platform. So we have the majority of the open access networks in Sweden operating in our platform.
And one more quick question, Isaac. Many people know you in the United States for the service territory product that helps define fiberhoods and neighborhoods. But you have another product that may be more common outside of the United States. Could you just speak to that difference between the service and the other area there?
Yes, sure. So there is Service Zones, which is the demand aggregation platform you're talking about. It's used before you build a network. So you have people sign up you divide your targeted area, your city or your county, into smaller neighborhood zones. You set the take rate target, like 50% of you have to sign up. Otherwise, we can't afford to build to you. So you have to go talk to your neighbors. And there are a lot of functionality to do this. But that is before you build a network, or as you're building a network out, because using that methodology, you can make sure you build where you have the highest take rate, the most revenue from customers, and you pair this with your cost estimates for building the infrastructure. Then you constantly build where you have the best business case, which means you need less initial investment to build a network. You will reach most customer fastest, and you can then build out incrementally after that using revenue from your best neighborhoods, which for a city, I speak to many cities and they say, well, we can't cherry pick. That's something for private sector. But I would say it's not cherry picking, it's spending your money most wisely to be able to build to the harder neighborhoods where you might have a struggle otherwise. If you start building there, you make no money. So that was the demand aggregation platform. And then the open access management platform, that comes in when you have a network to operate. And that's the marketplace where all the service providers publish their services and stuff.
Got it. Great. Wonderful. Well, what a great summary. And maybe we'll have time, but maybe not. We have so much to talk about Sweden and South Africa and some of those things you mentioned at the webcast, Broadband Communities and Broadband Breakfast yesterday. Monica, if you've got your audio working, which I hear now, tell us a little bit about Ting Internet and your take on this discussion we're having.
Sure. So thanks, Drew, and thanks for having me on today. Two Cows is Ting's parent company, and some of you old school tech folks might know of us from our early days as a shareware and freeware pioneer in the early 1990s. So we have a somewhat long legacy in the internet space of about 3 decades, and our business today includes domain services. That's sort of our one of our older lines of business. Today, we're the 2nd largest domain registrar in the world behind GoDaddy. We have a US mobile phone business, also under the Ting brand. And since 2014, we have been developing our fiber optic internet business, which is now in about 10 markets around the US. And in our internet business, we've utilized different models, including some where we build, own, and operate fiber to the prem networks completely, end-to-end ourselves, in Charlottesville, Virginia, which was one of our first networks. And then we also have partnerships where we, that are different flavors. We lease some fiber from a municipality, so it basically functions as a middle mile. We do that in several of our markets in the Raleigh-Durham area, including Holly Springs and Fuquay Varina. We also do that in Centennial, Colorado, and in Sandpoint, Idaho. So in all of those markets, we're working with the municipality to lease some core fiber from them, and then we build off from there to all of the individual homes and businesses. We also are doing, we also have some partnerships where either a municipality or a private entity has built a network and we provide service over top. So probably most widely known is Westminster, Maryland. We've been working with them since early 2015. And we've also more recently entered into agreements with private entities in California, in Fullerton and in Solana Beach, with entities there where they will be building the network, and like Westminster, will be providing service over top.
Excellent summary. Let me ask a question so that we can get this discussion out. One of the points that I expect we'll talk about, and might as well talk about it now, is the notion of full competition. Anyone can enter an open access network versus a more managed or limited competition. And I think that's the situation in Fullerton, which you mentioned, which is a network that Sci-Fi Networks is, based on my understanding, building. Could you tell us about the Solana Beach one and about your take on the full versus the narrow version of competition on an open access platform?
Sure. Tucows has always been a strong believer in the open internet. We've been very vocal about that in enabling access and providing the best user experience. So that being said, unlike the first 2 speakers, and as an ISP, we might have a slightly different view on open access. We're obviously also a publicly traded company, so we have a lot of accountability there around what the economics look like. So we need to make sure that if we're looking at either full open access or selective, or managed open access, that the terms make sense for us financially, and that they enable us to deliver the level of service that Ting is renowned for. So we are trialing participating in Fullerton in selective open access. So there will be 2 providers from the initial opening of the network, and that's Fullerton, California. The other 2 networks, both Westminster in Maryland and Solana Beach, also in California. Solana Beach is being built by Netley, and the Westminster network is a project in the city. On those networks, we have a head start period of 3 years in each phase, and that's really to offset the significant investment that we will make upfront to stand up a local operation, hire local people, do marketing, sales and marketing on the ground. And in those 2 markets, we also do the installation. So we do need an installation crew as well. And then, there are wholesale terms for the providers that come on after the 3-year period. So, what it really comes down to is we want to make sure that the investment that we're going to make is going to be offset in the revenues that we expect, that eventually it is open to other providers, and that we're really paying attention to the actual terms and how they make sense for us as an ISP. I think from a network owner perspective or from a city perspective, open access is quite ideal. Competition should increase, prices should stabilize or decrease, and it should mean only one build. But what we've seen in reality is it's a bit more nuanced. It usually increases competition and stabilizes pricing, but generally, I think this is an important point. Full open access, which is, we're in that in certain phases in Westminster now, and there haven't been other providers yet. But generally, full open access from the get-go is appealing to smaller providers that may not have their own capital to build their networks, that may not have the scale or marketing power, and for whom the sort of incremental adds of subscribers work for them financially.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important in this conversation to recognize that in theory, it is the ideal model, but in reality, it can end up with a slightly different level of service and level of provider depending on the terms. So it can be that some of those things may not be what you had intended, but I think that's an important part of the conversation.
No, a great dose of reality, and we appreciate you being on this to give us this perspective and this dose of reality. And I'm sure Roger and Isaac will have something to say about that. But we want to get to Daryl. Daryl Gentry, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and Next Level Networks, and what exactly your approach is to open access networks. Go ahead. You're unmuted now.
Hi, Daryl Gentry, founder and CEO of Next Level Networks. So I've spent the last 2 decades trying to improve residential broadband, started a CLEC that rolled out DSL service in 5 states. Later founded a wireless ISP focused on rural broadband delivery, and then later built a nationwide network to accelerate real-time traffic across the internet. And to introduce what we're doing at Next Level Networks, I thought I would go ahead and put up a few slides since it's so different than the other models that have come before. So let me. Hopefully that's working.
Yeah, yeah, there we go.
So we've pioneered a turnkey solution for communities to own their own networks. And so this is a 10 gigabit platform. And the key differentiator is that it's a turnkey solution for customers to own their own network. So we will build it and then we will operate it, but it's ultimately paid for by the end user customers. And of course, this takes a page from other community-owned infrastructure, which has been common for a very long time. And of course, even the original telephone networks were often community, co-op-based efforts. And so we've adapted this approach to fiber broadband systems. And so what this means is there's an upfront cost for the people that get together to build one of these networks to get it off the ground. And so comparing our approach to what's happened traditionally, again, the customer owns the network. We manage it on a turnkey basis. They don't have to have any special knowledge. They provide the CapEx for putting the infrastructure in the ground. From an operating standpoint, we don't have this build it and there will come problem where you have substantial outlays of capital that have to be recouped. We know our projects are cash flow positive on day one. And we really expect the communities to take the lead on acquiring the critical mass of customers. And we've in fact built our own crowdsourcing tool to enable this to happen very easily. And then finally, it leads to an ownership mentality. And so these sorts of networks should not have the issues with churn and lack of loyalty that traditionally you've found with ISPs in the past. So again, the community owns the last mile infrastructure. This is all the stuff that goes into the ground, the outside plant. This is the head-end cabinet electronics. Individual members own the actual drops to their homes. And so when I say community owned, community we define broadly. It could be a community of single-family homes. This could be mere dozens of homes at individual neighborhoods. This could be a town-wide effort. It could be an HOA or an owner of an apartment complex or an office park. So there's a lot of different ways to apply the model. But I know, I think for the purposes of this discussion, the most exciting idea is that a community with a sufficient amount of interest could get together and take their destiny into their own hands. we have relationships with the major middle mile providers for providing the backhaul, and it is an open access infrastructure. And so we will provide a baseline internet option, but we would invite any other ISPs in the region we're active in to interconnect with us at the regional head and data center, and the more the merrier. So just flip through really quickly the way we aggregate. So anyone can express interest in what we're doing, and this is in closed beta right now. It's not generally available. You can go to our website and request access. But we have this interactive tool based on census blocks where you can connect, you can choose as the prospective champion for your community which census blocks are going to be in or out. And then you can see on the left side, on the right-hand side, there's a scorecard, and that the cost of the implementation will change depending upon the size of the project. So a smaller project is going to have a much higher monthly recurring cost. In some communities, that's okay. If you're paying $700 a month for a T1 in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is a reality in our neck of the woods in Silicon Valley, you have a very different threshold for cost than someone that's in a more urban area that might have a cable and a DSL option available. Larger projects will have much better economics, and we can provide a 10 gig level of internet service for potentially under $50 if you have a large enough group of people that have gotten together. Once you've established the project, you crowdsource presubscriptions, and it's basically a map of the parcels of the community. And as you add more parcels, you work towards having a critical mass of interest and having a greenlit project. And so that's basically it. So
let me ask you a question, Daryl, and thank you for describing this and giving us this perspective for your very unique approach here. So tell us where you're doing this and what your experience has been thus far, Daryl.
Yeah, so we've pretty much been in stealth mode until very recently. We have been operating live service in Los Altos Hills, California. This is a community in St. Louis, in Silicon Valley, that has pockets of real, call it desperation, in terms of the lack of broadband infrastructure. Low single-digit DSL, maybe only a WISP option, and it's there's a number of champions using this tool right now. I think at last count we were over 10 to gather the critical mass of interest. Now, over time, we do expect to have financing options available so that this multi-$1,000 upfront assessment fee is less of a burden. But Los Altos Hills has the benefit of being a very affluent community, so this is not something that's causing too much shock for most of the people in that area.
Well, you used a phrase, Daryl, that I want to ask everyone about. You said, "Build it and they will come." This is not a build it and they will come model. So, and then you talked about kind of almost like particular areas. I imagine Isaac's going, well, this is kind of how service zones works. So let me ask this question of all of you, which is to say, is the notion of focusing on areas of greatest demand first really a sound way to go, or should you kind of do a universal citywide build? I mean, let's just get a perspective on that from everyone. Isaac and Roger first, and Isaac and Monica too, as to is the future of networks going to be fine-tuned neighborhood by neighborhood, or is it going to be a kind of a more universal decision within a particular city? And again, let's hear from Roger first, then Isaac, and then Monica. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Sorry.
So from our perspective, and we ran into this, and it presented a pretty big problem in Brigham City when we first did that, because we did a kind of a neighborhood by neighborhood campaign. Said, hey, your neighborhood is going to get built if you get to a certain threshold and all this stuff. And it became very apparent that the really affluent, nicer neighborhoods were going to hit their thresholds and the others were not. And we said, well, that's great for private sector. It's terrible for public sector, though. We do not want to create a worse digital divide than we have now. And that would be the result of, let's go build the nice areas and leave the others behind. So we want the campaign, we want the signups and all of that, but we're really using the higher take rates of the more affluent areas to kind of cross subsidize so that we can make these projects work financially across entire communities rather than leaving anyone behind. So very cool tools to be able to do that. But I see cherry pick the better neighborhoods as a private sector approach, and a public sector goal is to make sure everybody has the best options available to them. And even in trying to find opportunities to provide low-income opportunities or lower-cost services and other things like that. We want as many people as possible to benefit from these fiber networks, not just where it makes the most economical sense.
Yeah,
that's
Isaac,
my opinion.
No, thank you, Isaac. What's your reaction to what you heard?
Yeah, I can only agree. I mean. We never built our tool, for example, for someone to cherry pick and leave people without. We built a tool as an enabler to get off the ground and start building these networks, and then expanding, as Roger said, into the neighborhoods that are harder to reach. And
sorry, Isaac, but isn't the reality when you have a service zone model, you are going to have some areas that get it and some areas that don't?
I would say some areas get it first, and some areas get it later. And I mean, you have to weigh in technical parameters, how it makes sense. You can't go build east and left and any order. But I am just guessing that this model will be very dominant back home in Sweden. There's not a single network built any other way, and I would say, especially when you can use build it and it will come for a dense city center, and it will make sense, definitely. But if you go out like back where I'm from in the north of Sweden, where we have some towns and then we have smaller villages, well, make every village a project and have them reach the take rate target and then go out and build. And they will totally understand that you can just waste enormous amounts of money, which means building these villages, but you're not saying you won't get it. It's just we're gonna build first because we gotta spend our money wisely, and that way we can build to as many as possible. We have seen so many projects where you started in the wrong place and it didn't get anywhere. I mean, that's terrible. We see it all the time. So I would say build it and they will come. That's from the past. It's not even. I don't even think it exists almost anymore. Not in any complex builds.
Okay, Monica, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, from Tim's perspective, when we go into a municipality, unless there are neighborhoods that already have existing fiber, we're going to build the entire city. And, as Isaac mentioned, there are technical and logistical considerations in terms of the order of build. You're not going to go like this neighborhood over here and all over. But generally, we do try and build where the demand is strongest, at the front end of the build. And, that's sort of threefold. It increases competition among areas, and that helps increase awareness that that this technology is coming, and it generates excitement. And, thirdly, it's just sort of a core business tenet that you want to generate, like these are expensive. Building fiber networks, we all recognize, expensive, capital intense. So the sooner you start generating revenues to pay off that investment, the better. So if you do prioritize at the beginning of the build neighborhoods that are going to do that, that really helps everyone in the long run if you're committed to building the entire city.
Mm-hmm. Daryl, let me ask a kind of a variant of this question for you in reaction. Could you maybe speak to the difference between the neighborhood by neighborhood approach that you talked about, but you also mentioned that the owner can be anyone. It can be like a homeowners association, for example. Talk a little bit about the difference in the economics of the building where an existing neighborhood is versus an HOA. Well, there is obviously an existing neighborhood there, but there's a single entity, the HOA.
Yeah. So first of all, this is a very capital intensive effort. Make no bones about it. And so the money's going to have to come from somewhere, and the risk is going to have to come from somewhere. Our position is simply let the customers choose, let them self-select if this is an investment that they're willing to make for themselves. And frankly, the model could be applied to an urban or suburban area. This is a perfectly suitable model for a rural situation. The shared monthly expense of the backhaul circuit to get out of that neighborhood or that community or that city to a regional internet crossroads to a major data center is usually thousands of dollars a month. And so it's really the splitting of that cost that is the major pain point. In terms of the different types of customers, a homeowners association has an easier way of kind of aggregating that critical mass of interest. But whether it's an HOA or single family homes, a neighborhood, whether it's micro scale or large scale, one thing remains common for our approach, which is as more people join onto the network, that monthly cost goes down over time. All the costs are transparent and in the open, and there's a very straightforward pro rata distribution of those costs. And so as more people join, that high multi-thousand dollar expense gets defrayed. And so if an affluent neighborhood spearheads an effort in one part of town, and then the adjacent neighborhoods join on, they share in the benefit, everyone shares in the benefit of the monthly costs going down over time. In terms of the upfront fee, as I mentioned, financing is going to be a big part of this going forward. And instead of having a multi-thousand-dollar upfront fee, you could have financing over 10 or 20 years. We could partner with municipalities or other organizations, even organizations and funds focused on solving for the digital divide. So I would say it's just a consideration of the reality of the capital intensive nature of what this is that has led to our approach.
Yeah, I want to remind our watchers, viewers, that feel free to like and share this with others who may be interested. And this is, of course, just a preview for what we will be discussing at great length at Digital Infrastructure Investment on August 10th. And to stay updated on all of the events and activities that are taking place, we urge you to sign up for our email list at broadbandbreakfast.com. And also, you will need to sign up for the physical virtual event on August 10th in order to attend. I want to ask a question we've got from one of our listeners, Bert Klimas. I'll show it here for everyone. It's a bit of a long question, but I'm going to summarize it. So for a rural community, when you've got small towns, about 5,000 at most on the highway and corridor, and 80% lives outside of those towns, how do you make decisions about when to get out to those last homes? We're talking rural communities here. So let me actually start with you, Isaac, to talk a little bit about the rural component and what ways to address getting service to deeply off the grid type homes and neighborhoods.
Yeah. So this is why I think communities, municipalities should consider open access networks, because private sector, they will go after the money, and they should, because that's the role of a private company. If you as a community invite private providers, perhaps you subsidize them to even come in, and they start building out, they will not build to those rural homes. And now you're in a situation where if you will have anyone provide to them, you have to pay for it yourself as a community, and you have no revenue to offset. Like Roger said, they're building good neighborhoods, and they will be paying for not as good ones, but they can eventually build to everyone. Imagine if you have only the worst to build to. Well, that's really problematic. So I would say instead, if you have an open access infrastructure, based on wholesale fees, you will have the revenue. You will own the network. You can control what kind of services is delivered on that. And then you have the option and the possibility to also build those rural locations, even if it will cost less and the payback period will be 50 years or whatever. But as a community, you should really, and this is the huge difference, I think, and that Sweden did differently when they started building these open access networks so long ago. They didn't look at this as a telecommunications company. We are investing this much in this infrastructure, and then we're getting these revenues from our subscribers or the wholesale fees. You have to look at this as a community? What happens to our tax base?
It's an infrastructure investment, right?
If we don't have internet here, what happens to our tax base? Well, it will be 25% less in 15 years or even faster. Well, that's a no-brainer. That's the cost of your network right there. You shouldn't look as a community on this as, what if there was a cost calculation done for every single road in the country? Which ones would have been built? I think, you have to be looking forward into the future.
Let me ask Roger a question here. The 11 original cities of Utopia are all more or less along the Wasatch Front, which is the main mountain line, in Utah. But Morgan, of course, is outside of that. It's across the mountains, a very rural community. What was your experience that enabled that very rural community to get the internet from Utopia Fiber?
So that project only worked because we had a partnership with the Utah Department of Transportation, and we were able to get conduit and fiber access along a road going out to that community. And so we say, well, how does that apply to these things? And I compare it to roads, right? A city, even if it's rural, is really only responsible for the roads in their own city. And then we have county roads that extend, outside of those cities. And in some states some areas we have state roads, right? And so the counties kind of take the responsibility for interconnecting those more rural areas, and the state even more so with the larger roads. And I really think broadband ought to be treated the same way, where we can still have those more rural communities responsible for their local infrastructure, but we've got to have some programs from our counties and our state to help get them on an equal playing field with the more urban cities where the fiber routes already happen to be going through those cities. It is very difficult for one of these rural communities out, in the middle of nowhere to figure out. It's like, yeah, we might be able to build fiber in our community, but how in the world are we going to get to those those internet interchanges, right?
Right.
And so that is a need. And fortunately, in the case of Morgan, the state did come through on that. But there's a lot of other communities where that just isn't available.
Yeah. I want to get Monica's response to this question, but I would like to ask you another piece of it, Monica, which is what has the business models that you mentioned, Two Cows has been involved in domain services, your mobile services, now you're kind of operating on fiber networks. What have each of those different business lines taught you about how to approach fiber builds and your take on whether we will ever get fiber to rural areas?
Sure. Okay, so I'll answer the first question wearing my Two Cows hat. I'll answer the second question more or less wearing my hat before I came to Two Cows, which is I was a pioneer on a cooperative that was trying to solve the rural fiber problem. So with respect to what it has taught us, I think what was most interesting about us expanding into mobile and then eventually into fiber, is our experience in the domains business was we had a great call center, we had industry-leading customer support, we had a whole in-house capability for software development, and of course we had all of the other pieces. We had administration, we had finance supporting the business. And so when we got into mobile, we basically, we created branding, but we extended all of these other things we did, created an API to interact with, because we're a mobile virtual network operator, so we ride on most of the incumbent providers' networks in the US. So we just developed APIs for each of those providers and obviously signed contracts with them, but really it was just an extension of things we already did well. And then when we got into the internet business, it was similarly, here's something where there's a broken relationship between customers and most of the existing providers out there. I'll exclude our friends that were already in the fiber space, because generally most of our smaller non-incumbent fiber providers do a decent job. So that relationship was broken. We had the in-house capabilities. The only thing we really had to, put on our boots and learn was construction. And so, that's something that we've learned to scale. So that really was fundamentally what we realized is, if you're committed to a great customer experience and you have those in-house capabilities, and you understand the landscape, it was sort of a natural evolution for us to get into the business of being an ISP. Now, with respect to the first question, getting fiber to rural areas, I may have a somewhat different response. I was in the trenches for years in Western Massachusetts trying to get fiber networks built in communities there. And we looked at all different models. We did extensive financial modeling. We worked with many, many different stakeholders from the local to the county, to the state, to the national level to try and solve the problem. And I think the assumptions I came out of it with, and again, this is not necessarily Ting, but I think they're sort of basic business tenets, which is that in rural areas, you have to bring 100% government funding to solve the problem. And there may or may not be cost recovery in there, entire cost recovery. There will be some, but it may not be entire. So if you manage those expectations, that works. You know, in our case, we passed bond authorizations in these towns that were backed by property taxes. That's really the only way that small towns get anything done anyway. That's how they buy, you know, public safety equipment and things like that. And secondly, you have to do this as leanly as possible. And there are models and networks around the country that have done various aspects of that. And, you know, I think Daryl spoke to some of it, which is like the crowdsource, some of the local crowdsourcing funding from people. And, you know, we've seen EC Fiber do that in Vermont. There's a network, B4RN in the UK, where they've done a lot of in-kind work with laying the fiber to help offset the cost. So you have to make it lean. You have to try and offset the cost as much as possible. And that includes retaining as much margin as possible. So that may or may not be an open access model. The municipalities may want to be the retail provider. And the other thing is aggregate as many communities as possible, including some of those communities that may be getting better service. They may be just getting better cable service. But if they're denser and they have more serviceable addresses and they're contiguous to those rural communities, it still makes sense to have them in the model.
Awesome. Daryl, what's your thought on the rural question we've been talking about?
Agree that there's a role for the government to play, whether it's federal, state, or local, to provide assistance with the financing. I mean, I don't know that there's any other. I do completely agree with Monica that the rural challenge. I mean, you know, the idea that getting to these last homes. I mean, it's just inherently expensive. I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. So we are gearing towards our end. I want to ask everyone kind of a two-part question to give your final thoughts. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone that this is the first of 4 topics. The topic next week, and all 4 of these will be encompassed in digital infrastructure investment on August 10th. The topic next week is on infrastructure investment fund. And so we'll be drilling into the financial models that different investors have in supporting particularly the ownership piece of these types of networks. Then the next week, we're going to talk about the role the government has and can play. For example, we'll be talking about Rural Digital Opportunity Fund and whether that is any kind of solution for these sorts of networks. Also opportunity zones, whether those can be part of the mix in kind of tilting the balance sheet the way Monica and others were talking about. And then the fourth discussion will on June 27th, again, leading up to August 10th, will be on the neutral host infrastructure with regard to wireless, right? And how the digital infrastructure, not just the last mile, which we're talking about today, but the entire digital infrastructure and how that's evolving. And I'm particularly interested in the panel's thoughts on municipalities and the role that municipalities might play in open networks. So with that, I'm going to kind of turn it to each of you to address your final thoughts, if you would care to address municipal ownership of one piece of this, and also what are you looking for in digital infrastructure investment, our mini conference on August 10th. What are the pieces besides what we've been talking about today that are most of interest to each of you? Let's go in the order we started. Roger, Isaac, Monica, Daryl, before we close out. So go ahead, Roger. Got to unmute you first. There we go. Go.
So I would just say the time is right, or you know the opportunity is right, because this whole coronavirus thing has been very unfortunate, but it has demonstrated to everybody how critical this infrastructure is. You know, this isn't about streaming Netflix. You know, we talk about why are the standards from the federal level so low, and it's like, well, because it's good enough for Netflix. And you're like, okay, can we please get past that? People need symmetrical connections, dedicated connections, fiber infrastructure. And coronavirus has demonstrated that as now people are using their connections at home for working remotely, for education, for telemedicine. All of those things are symmetrical type uses of internet and used quite a bit. And so what we're seeing is a huge surge in demand. Cities are coming to us where they, in the past, said this isn't the role of, municipal government. This isn't something, we should just leave this to private sector. And it hasn't been any more obvious in the entire history than it is now that there's an enormous failure of the private sector providing even adequate speeds. And the frustration at the federal level, the standards are so ridiculously low that that's not a place we can just sit around and hope that's going to resolve it. I mean, RDOF is going to fund, 25 meg, 3 meg, connections for 10 years. And it's like, that is not a solution. And people have come to that conclusion. So the opportunity is ripe. Cities want better services. Counties want better services. Our rural areas, we need to do better than what any federal program has ever done. And the demand is there to make it happen. And there are all these mechanisms we can lean on for public finance, municipal bonds, county facilities, assessment area type things, or special service districts, you name it. There's a lot of mechanisms and ways to make these work. And the demand is there where we've never seen it before. We're busy, and I think everyone else in the room here will be too, as we meet that demand.
Thank you so much. Excellent summary. Isaac, what are your takeaway thoughts about municipalities, what you're looking forward to at digital infrastructure investment?
So when it comes to municipalities, I want to repeat, you shouldn't look at fiber as a traditional private telecommunications company does. It's necessary infrastructure, right? Just as Roger Timmerman just said, and every community needs this. And what I always stress is, if you are thinking 10, 15, 20 years ahead, an electricity cable will still have electricity on it, right? The fiber cable will have all sorts of stuff we don't even know about today. The communities will have sensors everywhere. And if you don't own that fiber infrastructure, what will you be charged as a community to be part of all these new services in the future? Be a smart city. Well, you need to control the infrastructure. I'm not saying you have to own it and build it, but you need to control it through a partnership or something. So municipalities, they really should consider how to get fiber into their communities, definitely. And I think in August, different funding ideas and perhaps the notion of it mustn't pay for itself through the services today, but it might pay for itself by being a smart community and being connected in the future.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Monica, what are your final thoughts on this topic?
2 quick points. First of all, when we see municipalities getting involved, to us it's really important as an ISP, because it indicates the awareness by town leadership or city leadership of the importance of fiber infrastructure to the future of economic development and quality of life in the town. So it really is an important indicator to us that they're willing to actually move the conversation into action. Secondly, I think what's important about municipalities getting involved, and this sort of, I think I've hinted at this already, is you need to make sure they are realistic about the financial outcomes, including cost recovery. By nature, municipalities are risk averse, and so they really need to be. You really need to manage the expectations that they may need to use taxpayer funding, and some of it may not be recovered. And also, they, by their nature, when they build infrastructure, they build it well, they build it thoughtfully, they build it to everyone. And as a private ISP, if there's existing fiber, we may not overbuild it for financial reasons. They are going to. And so all of those things factor into, they're going to build a great asset that's going to be multi-generational, serve the community well, and factor that into their expectations around whether or not they have complete cost recovery from taxpayer revenues.
Thank you so much, Monica. Great final thoughts. Let's turn to Daryl for your final thoughts, and then I'll have a few closing words.
Sure. I would just say that there needs to be a scalable business model that works in the real world. I mean, something that we've really not talked too much about today is the inevitable incumbent pushback that seeks to undermine efforts to make these improvements. And so the solutions that are brought to bear need to keep that reality in mind.
Great. Thank you very much. Roger, Isaac, Monica, Daryl, really appreciate your being with us. I want to remind everyone that next week we'll be talking about the experience of infrastructure investment funds. This is all, of course, a lead up to digital infrastructure investment at Broadband Community Summit, a physical virtual event on August 10th. I want to encourage everyone to sign up for our list so you can get notifications of when these events are happening and how you can sign up for our digital infrastructure investment. I want to say just one final word. I've been very inspired by this discussion. And it really comes down to the fact that you are not going to get around from the fact that rights of way are a function. So whenever you talk about infrastructure, there is too much a binary view where some people say the government should have no role, and some people say, well, municipalities should drive everything. Open access provides that opportunity for the public-private role, where the public sector has a key role in the rights of way. Perhaps the municipality has an ownership or facilitates ownership. And then you have private companies that are operating and offering services, those advanced services that we will be talking about at Digital Infrastructure Investment. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher at Broadband Breakfast. Thank you for being with us. Be here again next week, Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Take care.